The studio lights glowed soft and forgiving, the way they always did on the Drew Barrymore show, bathing the set in pastel warmth meant to feel safe, intimate, almost like a living room shared with millions. The audience applauded as Clint Eastwood stepped out from backstage, the clapping louder than usual, layered with reverence. This wasn't just another guest, this was a man whose face carried decades of American cinema, whose silence in films had often spoken louder than pages of dialogue. Clint acknowledged the crowd with a small nod, his expression composed, unreadable, and took his seat across from Drew Barrymore. Drew beamed, visibly thrilled, her hands clasped as she leaned forward. She spoke about growing up watching his movies, about how his work shaped her understanding of strength and restraint. Clint listened, head slightly tilted, offering a polite smile here and there. At first, everything unfolded exactly as viewers expected, warm, respectful, nostalgic. Drew asked about his early days in Hollywood, the long hours, the doubts, the years when success wasn't guaranteed. Clint answered in measured sentences, his voice low and even, sharing just enough to satisfy curiosity without opening any doors too wide. The audience laughed softly at his dry humor. Drew mirrored that laughter, nodding enthusiastically, clearly trying to keep the conversation light while still meaningful. She spoke about how times had changed, how audiences now look to artists not only for entertainment but for guidance, perspective, even moral clarity. Clint's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, resting his hands on his knees instead. His smile faded into something more neutral. Drew noticed, of course. She always noticed. She softened her tone, framing her thoughts carefully, asking how it felt to be viewed as an icon in an era so different from the one that shaped him. Clint paused before answering, eyes briefly scanning the audience as if measuring the room. Every era thinks it's different, he said finally. Most of the time, it's just louder. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but it carried an edge. Drew smiled, though her eyebrows lifted slightly. She followed up by talking about accountability in storytelling, about how narratives can influence culture in ways creators may not intend. She spoke gently, using inclusive language, careful not to sound accusatory. Still, the word, accountability, hung in the air longer than it should have. Clint's jaw tightened. He adjusted himself in the chair, the leather creaking faintly under his weight. I've always believed, he said slowly, that audiences are smarter than we give them credit for. They don't need lectures. They need honesty. Drew nodded, agreeing, but then added that honesty today often meant listening, evolving, and sometimes responding to criticism. The temperature in the room shifted again, not dramatically, not explosively, but enough that even casual viewers would feel it through the screen. Clint's eyes narrowed just a fraction. He inhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath. I didn't make movies to fit into conversations, he replied. I made them to tell stories. There was a brief, uneasy laugh from the audience. Drew reached out instinctively, placing her hand lightly on the arm of her chair, as if grounding herself. She reassured him that his work spoke for itself, that his legacy was unquestionable. Then she ventured into more delicate territory, mentioning how some fans wished legends would be more vocal during turbulent cultural moments. That was when the flicker crossed Clint's face. It was subtle, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it carried decades of stubborn resolve. He leaned back, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on Drew now rather than the audience. Silence doesn't mean absence, he said. Sometimes it means restraint. The room felt smaller. The pastel set, the warm lighting, the cozy couches, all of it suddenly seemed like a thin shell around something tense and unspoken. Drew tried to ease the moment with humor, joking about how she herself talked too much sometimes. The audience chuckled, grateful for the release, but Clint didn't laugh. He offered a thin smile, polite but distant. She pivoted, asking about his directing process, his preference for fewer takes, his trust in actors. Clint relaxed slightly, describing his belief in preparation and instinct. For a moment, the tension faded. Drew leaned back, visibly relieved, praising his efficiency and respect for performers. Clint nodded, appreciative, and the rhythm of the show seemed to recover. But Drew, true to her style, circled back, not aggressively, but curiously. She spoke about younger generations discovering his films and interpreting them through modern lenses. How do you feel, she asked carefully, when people want context from you about those interpretations? Clint's expression hardened again. I don't correct audiences, he said. Once the work is out there, it's theirs. Another pause followed, heavier this time. Drew hesitated, then asked about responsibility, not obligation, she clarified, but opportunity. Opportunity to speak, to guide, to explain. Clint's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked down briefly, then back up, his gaze steady and unwavering. I've spoken through my work for 70 years, he said quietly. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and nervous murmurs. Drew smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She thanked him for that honesty, acknowledging the weight of such a long career. Still, the energy had changed. The conversation felt less like a friendly exchange and more like a careful negotiation, each sentence tested before being released. As the segment continued, Drew asked one final question in this part of the interview, framing it as reflective rather than challenging. She asked about regret, whether there was anything he wished he'd done differently in such a long, influential career. Clint went still. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and unplanned, long enough that someone backstage likely considered cutting to commercial. Clint exhaled slowly, shaking his head once, a small, decisive motion. A faint smile appeared, but there was no warmth in it. I don't do well with being boxed in, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. And in that moment, even before he moved, it was clear something was about to break. For a split second after Clint Eastwood spoke, the studio seemed to forget how to breathe. The faint hum of cameras, the soft rustle of audience members shifting in their seats, even the distant murmur from backstage all felt suddenly too loud. Drew Barrymore blinked, her smile frozen in place as she searched Clint's face for a sign that he was finished, that maybe this was just another sharp-edged remark that could be smoothed over with warmth and laughter. But Clint's body had already decided what his words had not yet fully announced. He leaned forward, palms pressing against his knees, the movement slow but deliberate. It was the kind of motion that carried finality, the same controlled resolve audiences had seen in countless films, now playing out unscripted under studio lights. As he stood, the chair shifted slightly behind him, the sound startling in the sudden quiet. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, instinctive and involuntary. Drew rose too, almost reflexively, her hands lifting in a gentle, placating gesture. Clint, she said softly, her voice warm but edged with surprise, I didn't mean to. He turned toward her, not angrily, not dismissively, but with a calm that felt heavier than anger. Up close, his expression was composed, his eyes steady. I know, he said. No harm meant. His tone was even, but firm enough to signal there would be no further discussion. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, to laugh, or to remain silent. This wasn't the dramatic storm-out people were used to seeing in viral clips. There was no shouting, no insult, no sudden spike in volume. That was what made it unsettling. Clint adjusted his jacket, smoothing it down as if preparing to leave a meeting rather than a live television show. Drew tried once more, her instinct always to bridge gaps rather than let them widen. I really appreciate you being here, she said, sincerity pouring through her words. Your perspective matters. Clint paused, already angled toward the edge of the stage. He nodded, a small gesture of respect, and allowed a faint smile to return, this one genuine, though reserved. I appreciate the invitation, he replied. This just isn't my kind of conversation. With that, he took a step away. The cameras followed him, uncertain whether they should. A producer's voice crackled faintly through someone's headset off stage. Clint walked with the same measured pace he'd carried all his life, neither rushing nor lingering, acknowledging no one as he crossed the set. The applause that finally broke out was scattered and unsure, some clapping out of respect, others out of sheer nervous energy. Drew stood alone in the center of the stage, hands clasped in front of her, watching him disappear behind the curtain. For a brief moment, her composure wavered. Her eyes flicked downward, her shoulders rising and falling with a controlled breath. Then, just as quickly, she turned back to the audience, professionalism settling over her like a well-worn coat. Wow, she said lightly, forcing a small laugh that didn't quite land. Well, that was unexpected. A few audience members laughed in response, grateful for permission to react. Drew nodded, acknowledging the moment without dismissing it. We're going to take a quick break, she added, her voice steady again. We'll be right back. The screen faded to commercial, but the moment didn't fade with it. Backstage, whispers erupted almost immediately. Crew members exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others wide-eyed with disbelief. No one had anticipated this, not on a show built around gentleness, vulnerability, and emotional openness. Clint Eastwood walking off felt almost surreal, like watching two eras of Hollywood collide and realize they spoke different languages. When the show returned from break, Drew addressed the audience directly. She spoke about respect, about differences in communication, about how conversations don't always go as planned. She didn't criticize Clint. She didn't apologize for her questions either. Instead, she acknowledged the complexity of sharing space between generations, perspectives, and expectations. The audience applauded, this time with clarity. Meanwhile, the internet was already on fire. Clips of the walk-off hit social media within minutes. Some captions framed it as defiance, others as discomfort, others as a quiet protest. Comment sections split cleanly down the middle. Supporters praised Clint for refusing to be cornered, calling his exit dignified and honest. Critics argued that walking off a show built on dialogue proved exactly the point Drew had been making. Think pieces began forming before the episode had even finished airing. By evening, headlines multiplied, each one sharpening the moment into something more dramatic than it had been in real time. Eastwood snubs daytime TV. Generational. Clash goes live. When legends refuse to explain themselves. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the space between. Drew addressed the incident again the following day, this time with more reflection. She spoke about her admiration for Clint's work, about the importance of asking questions even when answers are uncomfortable. Her tone wasn't defensive. If anything, it was thoughtful, even compassionate. Viewers praised her restraint, her refusal to turn the moment into a spectacle. Clint, for his part, didn't release a statement. He didn't post online. He didn't call in to clarify. Those close to him said he felt no resentment, no regret. He had simply recognized a moment when staying would mean explaining something he had never believed needed explanation. In the days that followed, the debate softened into something more nuanced. It wasn't about who won or lost the exchange. It became a broader conversation about how public figures age in public, how expectations shift, and whether silence is itself a form of communication. Media scholars weighed in. Fans revisited Clint's films, searching for answers in the work itself, just as he had suggested. And somewhere beneath the noise, one quiet truth remained: nothing explosive had actually happened. No voices were raised, no insults were thrown, yet the impact lingered longer than most televised arguments ever did. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement isn't made in anger or volume. Sometimes, it's made when someone simply stands up, nods politely, and walks away.